It's been a year since George Floyd, an unarmed black man, was murdered by a police officer in front of a crowd. We saw the nationwide protests go on for months, and it seemed like the country was finally having a racial reckoning, which was long overdue. But what has actually changed since last May? We checked in with black educators, activists, and a black police officer to see what they think. My first question to you all, how would you describe the last year in maybe like 2 or 3 words?
Exhausting. The beginning of a revolution. That's what the last year has been. It sparked a global revolution.
I'll say movement building.
They're changing same. There are some deep continuities in terms of injustices. At the same time, there's something specific about this moment and distinctive.
Obviously, George Floyd was not the first unarmed black person to be killed by police and not the first one that went national or went viral or became a hashtag or forced protesters into the street. But it seemed like, over the past 10 years or so, and I would say maybe dating back to Trayvon Martin, that these kind of moments came and went and we saw them in waves. So in 2021, do you think that the pressure is still on? Do you think we're kind of still in the moment, or is it fading?
This time is different. As someone who started marching when Sean Bell was murdered by the NYPD, who was on the ground for Trayvon Martin, for Eric Gardner, and we didn't have short, quick victories and wins. But it was something about this pandemic that allowed the world to actually see and to process and to react. And I feel it going. And now the new generation's taking over activism and social justice. When you have millennials and Generation Zers who we're not our parents' generation. We're not our grandparents who are going to hurry up and wait. We want action now, and we now know that unrest in the street leads to hardcore policy changes.
I think there's still, a revolutionary spirit in the air. And I would say that revolutionary spirit is drawing on the moment, but I would also say I think it's drawing on past moments. To me, when I look at some of the most successful movements, it's those movements that understand the distinctiveness and the singularity of a moment, but are also connected to past moments. So I think about my students, and I think about how many of them were radicalized by what was going on across the country. And at the same time, if you are first year or second year in college, you're also moved by, maybe your older brother who can talk about Rakia Boyd or Trayvon Martin or Troy Davis, and to also recognize that I am probably the age of some of my students' parents. I'm 44. There were 3 things that shaped me in the 90s. The release of Nelson Mandela, probably Magic Johnson's announcement that he was HIV positive, and Rodney King. And so what you have is this interesting moment where there are 3 generations of folks who've been thinking about police brutality and state-sanctioned violence and the criminal punishment system together and in different ways. I hope I'm doing that. We're all listening to each other and understanding that we all have something unique to bring. And that's not to say that there's not intergenerational conflict, but I think that's what makes this moment.
For me, it was feeling like we were making some progress, but when those white folks stormed the Capitol, to be able to pull that off, right? And then to debate it after the fact, let alone all the other things that have happened, right? The increased killings, right? Situation with voting in Georgia, right? This assault on critical race theory. The fact that these things are going on and they're still debatable shows that, folks aren't feeling the pressure, right? Because I think the people who were doing it before, they were doing it before and they're doing it after, right? And we saw them in the summer and right after, a lot of people got activated and a lot of white people got woken up a little bit and all of a sudden felt that pressure, right? And they started retracting and going back, right? They put their cats and memes back up on their profile pictures and they kept it pushing, right? It went back to business as usual and privilege as usual, right? So I think there are a group of folks who feel it. There's some middle range of people that got turned on and activated, fighting for some change. And there's some people who took a step back and they're not really doing those things anymore, right? The fact that we had a whole trial for George Floyd's family, for Derek Chauvin, right? The fact that it was debatable and we didn't know what was going to happen shows that we're still not there and we got work to do.
What about you, Shante, as a police officer? Do you feel like the pressure is still on? What is it like being around other police officers? Are they kind of still on edge or feeling different about their jobs?
Yeah, I feel like the pressure's on for me personally to really speak up. I feel like I cannot be quiet. I feel like if I'm quiet, then I am part of the problem. So for me personally, I feel very, very pressured. As far as other officers, I do work at the middle school, so I just have to preference that. I'm not around a lot of officers, so I don't hear the talk a lot. But I believe like the leadership is feeling that pressure too. Like the community is no longer just going to sit down, and they want answers and they want changes.
How has your life changed personally as an educator or just as a Black man in this country? How has it changed in the last year?
There were those of us that were doing this before, and people before me, right? And we were the crazy ones before, right? We were the ones that were pushing the envelope. We were the angry Black or brown or poor or women in the room, right? And all of a sudden, there's this moment where like, maybe we're not so crazy. Maybe everybody wants to get in this fight with us, right? So I think it felt affirming, right, for me as a Black person to at least have people saying that maybe I shouldn't be killed in the streets. That feels better, right, than maybe I should be. You know what I mean? And I think for me as an educator, now we had a context that people could kind of connect all this work to. Now people understand, okay, that's what time it is, and that's why we need to do this work. So for me, it made the work a little bit easier. And then my work is doing racial equity trainings and whatnot. It blew up, right? Because all of a sudden people are like, oh man, I need to get it together. Yeah. There's some things I need to learn. Let me ask some questions. So for me, it's been busy this last year, just trying to do some work and people asking the right questions.
How about you, Shavonna? How has your life changed in the last year as the leader of a large Black Lives Matter capital?
Well, the death threats have been a little bit intense. My actual day-to-day way of life, from white supremacists to liberals, depending on which side my statement falls upon. So that's been changing. But as an organization, when the world took to the streets, we knew as leaders we had to go in. So we shut ourselves in after we got back from Minneapolis, after we were on the ground about 48 hours after the world found out about the murder of George Floyd. And we came out with 24 pieces of policy, and we announced them on June 7th. And since then, we've had about 5 laws passed and 2 up for votes. We've expanded our organization to Georgia and to Houston, Texas, where we're doing indoor farming. Like, our conversation, I'm not trying to convince white folks of anything. I'm not trying to convince law enforcement of anything. If I can get concrete laws passed, that's amazing. But our focus is on Black people. No matter who's the president, no matter how many cases we have and we see, nothing seems to change. We're still going to be poor. We're still going to be last on the list. And we're still going to have an administration that won't pass legislation to protect us unless the city is literally on fire. Is the only time that Black people get what they want in this country.
Shante, I know you spoke with Vice last year, shortly after George Floyd's death. And I recall you saying that, you know, the next day you didn't want to put your uniform on and you didn't want to wear that badge. How has your life changed in the last year, and do you still feel that way?
I do sometimes feel that way. I contemplate making career changes. I want to be more in the social justice. But then I struggle too, because I'm like, okay, if I'm not at the table speaking up, then who's going to do it? And I know I'm not the only one. So I don't want to act like I'm putting all this weight on my shoulder and I'm this great person. So I struggle with that every day.
I'm going to be honest, it's been intense just dealing with COVID-19 and being an educator and also being the chair of a department. So just the everyday functioning is difficult, but also trying to move with clarity and ethics. When I say being ethical, what I mean by that is one of the things that the university will do in this moment is say, let's push anti-racist education. Let's hiring more Black faculty and people of color as something that's revolutionary. When that's not it. And we'll do that while there is a problem with policing on these very campuses. So at a lot of universities, there have been calls for divestment and abolition in terms of policing, because this is an issue. In 2015, one of my students, Martise Johnson, was brutally beaten at the university by alcohol bureau and control officials. And so I think that has been the challenge in this particular moment, is to be very clear about why we are here. And we are here to deal with the criminal punishment system. We're here to deal with policing. We're here to deal with incarceration. For me, not to talk about, Confederate monuments. Because if you're not careful, that's what can happen. You can find yourself in a moment where you're with a foundation and they're offering things and it's about something else and not this. And so that's what I've been trying to balance too, is just being honest about that, but also turning inward. I don't have to leave Charlottesville. I don't have to leave my campus to talk about policing.
Yeah, the connection I want to make is working in schools too. I work in a middle school, right? And the K-12 setting. And we can easily think that we're talking about one issue, right? And say that it is just about police officers on the street. But for me, right, it's about the mentality of policing, mainly in my case, Black and brown poor bodies in the school without police. This mentality of assimilating brown children into white culture, right? This idea of watching and being obsessed with the behavior of poor brown and immigrant children as opposed to their learning and their engagement and their joy, right? So what I appreciate is this connection of like, okay, well, great, Derek Chauvin is one person, but who's showing up like Derek Chauvin right here? And how is that mentality showing up in me, right? As an educator, whether I'm a leader or a teacher or a security guard or a counselor, right? This idea of what's that mentality about it, right? And this is what is broken about our society. When we acknowledge that it is everywhere, then we start looking for it and we start addressing it. This year kind of gave us that moment because it didn't become a one issue thing. It was now we're talking about systemic racism, which is a much larger conversation than just an individual police incident of police brutality.
Well, what have you seen as far as changes in the way that white people behave, whether it be in your school or your everyday life?
I mean, I think on the mid-range, like the folks who are weren't sure where they were going to go, they're maybe a little more moderate with their politics. I think they're become a little more progressive, a little more liberal, asking some more questions. They know some vocabulary words they should say, right? They know the difference maybe between anti-racism and racism now. Where I didn't see change is what we all experienced, and I bet everyone can speak to this. You tried some stuff and you found out where the ceiling was. Because you're like, okay, great, we got this moment, we got this opportunity, we're writing this legislation, whatever that might be. And all of a sudden people say, oh yeah, that's cool, but we're not gonna do this much though. That's the ceiling.
I just love being on here with the educators. We decided to open up our own school. We founded our own Montessori school in the poorest congressional district because we wanted our children to be educated by people who look like them, who have their shared experience, who knows that our history doesn't begin from the slave boat. And in terms of white people, to answer your actual question, I don't know, I'm just past it. Like, if I can get the governor to listen, or a president or someone elected who has the power of the pen, cool. If people decide to Google or listen to the Black struggle and they want to take up space and be on the ground, I'm all cool for that. But I'm here for full Black liberation. So every single obstacle that's standing in my people's way that is denying us of equity, that's important. If you're a white ally and you have resources, do you want to invest in a Black community? Because we've seen so much divestment. That's why we have crime. That's why we're over policed. That's why all these things are happening, because of where we're falling. But in terms of trying the conversation, I feel like that's how America distracts revolutionaries. There's still no anti-lynching bill. Reparations isn't a conversation. How much more do we really need to explain to white folk? Because Martin Luther King was amazing at it. He was good. There was Jesse Jackson, all these other folks. I think that people, white folks, allies or foes, they understand what's going on. I don't discredit or undermine my enemy. I'm tired of the questions and trying to make them see either get on board or get out of the way.
How about you, Shante? Have you seen a change in behavior from any white officers that you might work with or encounter at the department?
I have. I've seen a change in a few of them. They ask more questions, not really to me, but like go out and do their own research and go to webinars or whatnot and try to figure out more stuff. So I think more people are intrigued or trying to educate themselves on what's going on. I'm not saying that's for everybody, but there's a handful.
Joe, can you talk about the ways in which education works to uphold white supremacy and how that is built and how our history books are so inaccurate? I mean, and how you have to kind of do your own research to learn what you did not learn, in K through 12.
I appreciate that we're having a conversation about white supremacy, right? Just because when we were distracted and talking about diversity or competence, right, or inclusion, right, we were only allowed to have a certain conversation, right? But once we insert white supremacy and with that racial hierarchy, then we can get somewhere, right? Because then we're talking about how is racial hierarchy both being communicated and maintained, right, through the education system. So if you're going to go curriculum, yes, right, what stories are we reading about, right? Is it only old dead white men? Are those the only people who ever did anything great? Or do we learn about everybody else, right? And that's just the representation of the stories that we listen to, right? The representation in the novels that we read, right? Because when brown children can see themselves in the novels, in the contributions to science and technology and history, then we're going to change where they feel they fit in the racial hierarchy. Then we look at the testing, right? I mean, we can't talk about AP testing and the SAT test without talking about the eugenics movement and that racist movement, right? There was a pseudoscience movement, right? So when we look at those pieces, then we can ask ourselves, is it challenging racial hierarchy and it's and working towards racial equity or equality at some point or not? And that's the work that needs to happen.
Shantae, you are an officer in a school, so your job is to basically police kids and police kids' behaviors. So how have you looked at your position?
Yeah, so I really don't get involved with kids with discipline when it comes to school stuff. If I tell them, come get me, or I'll come if somebody's in danger. So I make those strict lines. The schools, they need to figure out how they're going to do their discipline, but I'm there if somebody is in danger. So I make that very clear, and I have to remind the staff constantly about that. Like, that's a kid's in the hallway, okay, not in class. That's not, I don't come and tell them to go to class. That it has nothing to do with me. You can tell them to go to class. I'll ask them how their day is going, but I'm not in charge of that kind of stuff. And so for me, my biggest challenge is constantly reminding the staff of what I am there for, safety, and me too is like developing the positive relationship. So today I taught yoga. Did yoga with the kids. That's my other big goal, is developing those positive relationships.
Speaking of policing, Shavonna, what are your thoughts on the future of policing?
Perfect world, what I'm striving for and fighting for every single day is the full abolition. I believe that law enforcement in any capacity, no matter how you dress it up, is deep-rooted in racism. It comes from slavery. America created its own system. It's loosely shaped off of that of Britain's, and that's why it's decentralized, and it was created to oppress Black people. And as we see with law enforcement, it's a tool of white supremacy. What we really need to get rid of is, I support all unions except for the police union. They hold too much power. They fund politicians. That's why we don't get real laws. Our communities don't need more police. We need more social workers. People need jobs. There's a direct correlation between places with the highest rates of murder and the highest rates of unemployment. You don't see crime happening, crimes of opportunity, which usually happen among poor people, happening in the suburbs because people have jobs, people have resources. So a perfect world, there will be no law enforcement as we know it here. And that's what I actively fight for every day.
Shantae, how does it feel to hear her say that?
I mean, I've heard that before. So the only thing is like, I just want to know how, for the people that are doing, violent crimes, the shootings, do you think that will all go away?
Absolutely not. And that's why we believe in a holistic approach. That's why we believe in capital investments. That's why we believe in social workers. Because let's be real, cops do not prevent crime. And there are systems where local law enforcement do not have guns. We see it on a federal level, and that works as well. So I know that everyone's been brainwashed into thinking that we need the cops or the bad guys to all take over. No, America, we're smarter, we're more intellectual about that. We understand mental illness playing a huge part, and we understand poverty. Let's work on eradicating poverty, and then we definitely wouldn't need law enforcement.
Speaking of Minneapolis, I was on the ground out in front of the courthouse when the Chauvin verdict was read.
Derek Chauvin trial has just told the judge that they have reached a verdict.
Guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter.
They erupted in cheers 3 times in a row.
Like Joe mentioned earlier, there kind of was this questionable moment. Like, even though we saw what we saw, even though it played out on national TV, people were still like, this could still end in an acquittal. So after the verdict was read and he was found guilty on all 3 charges, there kind of was this sigh of relief. What impact do you think that is going to have on police accountability going forward? Siobhan, I'll start with you.
Well, I think that officers know that a badge is no longer a license to kill. I think that we're going to start seeing, hopefully very soon, the end of state-sanctioned killings. I think people know once we start working towards more things, it's not just shutting down a precinct. I want people to truly understand what we mean by defund and abolish. What we mean is tearing down that whole culture, tearing down the blue wall of silence, officers knowing that they can no longer lie on police reports, officers knowing ending qualified immunity. You've heard that recently. That means that officers are civilly liable, that you can come and snatch away the home, the boat, and all the things if there's wrongdoings on a job. Officers cannot falsify government documents. I think it's going to shake them. I think the issue is the culture of police. And that doesn't matter who the president is, who the commissioner, who the mayor is. Police operate more strictly than any gang known to man, more so than La Cosa Nostra, any cartel, with their no-snitch policy. That's why we can't keep them. That's why we have to create laws to break down this wall of silence. So I think a lot of officers are waking up, and I'm very proud of this. And I will continue to shove more legislation down their throats until they truly wake up and they disappear.
Claudrina, what impact do you think the verdict will have?
Well, one impact that it has is there are always these moments in U.S. history where folks who are afraid that some significant change is going to happen, they need moments that confirm the perfectibility of their project. I think the verdict can also have the possibility of turning people inward. I don't think it's just about policing, but I also think it's about the law. It's the structure of the law itself. So let's take, for example, conversations about the chokehold. But if you read it and it says, unless a law enforcement official feels threatened, that's such a subjective reading. So that law can pass. When you think about Trayvon Martin, you can't just think about Zimmerman. You have to think about the stand your ground law. If you actually read that law, you're like, or maybe Zimmerman was not guilty. Within the context of a culture in which Blackness is criminality, in which Black crime is just waiting to happen. I don't think that question of the decision can be separated from a deeper question, about the very law itself. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia. After August 11th and 12th, 2017, when I was getting ready to go back into my classroom, I had to deal with the First and Second Amendment and how a certain people worship at the altar of the First and Second Amendment. That's what I mean, the very law itself. And that gets to the heart of the very founding of the settler state. It's not just policing too, it's the law itself.
The first piece, right, is at least for once, there's a message that Black people are not disposable, right?
Right.
And I'm going to say maybe there's more, but we could point to this moment and say, at least for once, there was a message that said that we cannot just be killed like dogs in the street and ignored, right? The impact is like, it's the affirmation. That's why they don't want to give this to us, right? It's because then we're like, we want all the other ones too. A reckoning for me was when Oscar Grant was killed in Oakland, right? I was in California. I was teaching kids and we had to process that, right? Like, I want that one too, right? I want all the other ones, right? So folks want us to be comfortable. They want to get comfortable at this moment of feeling like they've arrived and they've done enough with that one because they got that one because he killed George Floyd for 9 minutes on camera in front of everybody. Undebatable, right? I want the ones that can go either way. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's going to show me some impact. This idea of like, if you're killed, you can have justice for being murdered. That's neutral, right? But this idea of, can we get more than neutral? Can we win, right? Can we win too? Like, that's a different thing to ask, right? So for me, the impact is like, I understand that's the question, but that's the wrong question. The question is, what are we going to do next?
I ran for president because I believe we're in a battle for the soul of this nation. And the simple truth is, our soul will be troubled as long as systemic racism is allowed to persist.
Shavonna, what do you think about the Biden administration's kind of role in how they're promoting social justice and racial reckoning?
So far, it's been a little over 100 days, and President Biden and Vice President Harris have smacked Black people in the face. In November, they screamed and shouted about how Black women saved democracy, and they flipped the state of Georgia. Where are the executive orders coming out? I just want to be very clear. I don't promote hate. I stand by any marginalized people. I don't think you should be harmed because of your race, color, or creed. The Stop Asian Hate hashtag happened for 3 months, and there was executive orders and about $47 billion allocated. My entire life, my parents' whole life, because they were at a rally, my grandparents before that, everyone's been marching and advocating. There's nothing on the anti-lynch bill. There's nothing on reparations. And I think this should make Black people wake up. First, we need to stop voting down the line just because they're a Democrat. They are not our friend. We need to start negotiating for what we absolutely want in this country because our votes are not appreciated. And more importantly, we need to figure out how we can save ourselves. How can we help each other? How can we go back to that sense of community that we had during, let's be real, segregation, before we ran into that burning house? Can we get back to that community? Because no white man, woman, lawmaker is coming to save us. The only people who can save us is ourselves.
Joe, what would you like to see happen over the next year?
For me, the talk is nice. It's cheap, though, and it's easy to do, right? And it's easy to forget who said what, right? So it is about moving from talk to action, but it's not about action. I was talking about structures and policy. It is about, I think anti-racism is a great framework. The question is, how do we put it into practice? How do we put it into policy? In a couple of weeks in the summer, I'm doing a training on that where I'm pushing teachers and educators to say, cool, you talked about it? Cool. Where is the policy? And the policy is your grading policy. The policy is, what are you teaching, your curriculum, right? The policy is, where do kids go to school? What funding do kids get in the schools? Because we can measure policy and we can see outcomes. Because I'm not going to do a test to see how racist people feel they are, right? That's not the test that I'm interested in. I want to see the outcome shifting, right? To get there, it's got to be structures, policies, right?
Shantae, what do you hope to get out of the last year? What do you hope to see in this next year?
I just hope to see the culture of law enforcement change. I want to see that good old boys and the blue wall of silence out. You know, I want to be able to speak freely to anybody. And, you know, I just want to be able to speak. The blue wall of silence, gone. Gone.
I hope that we continue to develop and nurture liberatory zones where we can have certain conversations together, where we can build institutions that model the kind of world that we want to live in. I think that is extremely important. And I think it's going to be important after we take an assessment of what COVID has done to our institutions, educational, religious, spiritual, anything to the community, what a year and a half of COVID has done in terms of education. I want to see a response to what I see as a systematic effort to disfranchise Black people. We got to address what's happening with the Voting Rights Act and what has happened since the gutting of that act, which I think also shaped so many other things. And then the last thing is economics, in terms of thinking about not just the living wage, but a living income. And also thinking about workers' rights and protection in this particular moment. And not just, sort of thinking about COVID, but also thinking about what happened in Bessemer and Amazon.
I want to see people reclaim their power. I think that's what white supremacy does. And I think that's what living 400 plus years under systemic oppression has most robbed my people of, is how powerful we truly are. I want people to look back on this year and celebrate the small victories, because we usually don't have them. Out of about 16,000 police-involved murders and killings, there's only been 8 convictions. So people reclaim your power. Know that these politicians, that they work for you. You have the power to get them elected. You have the power to fire them. Even your mayor works for you. Your tax dollars pay for law enforcement. It pays for your school system. Know that you are powerful and demand more, because enough has been enough.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!